how do we overcome trauma? What are the different pathways?
The very first thing is to acknowledge to ourselves and often to others, which might be one other person, it might be in words, spoken, it might be written, like what the trauma has been. Right? Because the lessons of trauma, the evil lessons of trauma, and I'll use the example of my own life, the lesson that told me that I was shameful, cursed, and hopeless, right? It's a very evil lesson, right? But my brain will say it over and did say it over and over and over to me. And if that just sits inside, that's how trauma festers. That's how trauma hijacks our thoughts, our emotions. So being able to say to ourselves and to another, like, this is what's happened, right? Okay, this is what's happened. We're built to massage words and to create meaning through words, right? Like we don't massage pictures, right? Images. We talk and massage meaning with words. So, so when I finally went to see a therapist, and I could say, my brother, whatever words I would have said, like he killed himself, and I can't accept it, or I can't imagine it, and like I let it happen, like so I had to say those things, right? So then I could begin to bring some sense of truth to it, and I think it was a long time ago, but the therapist probably said something like, okay, probably sees on you, it's you let it happen, it's your fault, right? Because you got to get at those things so that one can begin to bring into focus, what does the trauma mean and what does it not mean? I mean, a classic example is the what would you say to someone else example. You'll say, well, now how many times have it's just, I could cry if I stop and think about it enough. You stop and talk to someone who is sexually assaulted through no fault of their own, who comes in and tells the story they've been telling themselves about how it's their fault. They should have walked home a different way. They should have dressed differently. They should have left earlier, right? I wrote about it in the book over and over and over. Now you have a person who, let's say you take a person who's intelligent, engaged in the world, who's like capable of understanding lots and lots and lots of things, but doesn't understand that. Right? If it were someone else, that person would understand in a moment. That's not that person's fault, right? So what you want to do is overcome the fact that the negative emotions, the hijacked emotion systems of trauma are telling that person a lie, and they're telling them so strongly and so awfully, so meanly, that the person just takes it inside and starts to see it as true. Right. So you begin to hold that up to the light of day. And again, one example could be, okay, so the person who's coming in next has actually been through something similar, right? And can you stay and just tell her how it's her fault, right? Mm-hmm. And like, oh my God, no, because I could never, like, then they see, right? I mean, again, this is not always how you do it, but sometimes you can get a person to see like, well, that would be the most horrible. How could you do that? Right. And the person can maybe come out, they're doing it to themselves. So you begin to put words in a structure and say, okay, like, let's look at what's going on inside of you. Like, you don't have to be scared of anything you're thinking and feeling. In fact, the fear is in not exposing it to the light of day. That's where it gets the best of us. And now, like, everything is different. And whether that involves use of medications for intrusive thoughts and depression, or there's no medicines needed, but it's all reframing, like whatever it may be that comes next, the whole world has changed when the person has acknowledged what's happened, exposed it to themselves and to trusted others around them, and begun to look at it in some way other than the stuffed in an evil box place that the trauma initially puts us through the reflexes it creates in us.
It's interesting that there's power to just saying it out loud.
Right.
So first saying your perception of it out loud, then in that case, that might be your fault. And then working through that it may not be.
Any experienced therapist will tell you this, that every now and then it will happen that someone will come and they'll say something. Usually it's very early on in the process. They'll say something they've never said before, and they immediately are like in an entirely different place, and they may have been for decades, right? And I can remember a person saying that a coach had raped him, and just saying it. This was decades before, and everything was different. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but his life was in a different place. As soon as he said it, he could see, how dare, like, he thought that person did that to this child. The child was me. He never thought it until he said it out loud, because his mind was going over and over with why it was his fault, what he did to deserve it, how he kept going back, so it must be his fault. It was in it. As soon as he put words to it, he saw the truth of it. And there was a bifurcation in the path of life then. And any therapist has stories like that, which just shows the immense power that it can even be that just uttering the words makes just a cascade of change all at once.
Just saying those words to another human being. It makes you wonder about that compulsive loop that happens in our heads,
right?
Until it's brought to the surface. It's so interesting.
Entirely non-productive, the loops. And sometimes even if we put, what would I say to another? Let me write it down. It can get rid of those loops in our brains. Any even thought of outward expression is the enemy of those internal persecutory negative thought loops.